The explosion shattered the morning silence, like thunder splitting the sky. Smoke billowed thick and black from the overturned convoy vehicle, flames licking hungrily at twisted metal and scattered equipment. Through the chaos, 8 voices screamed from inside the burning wreckage, but while seasoned soldiers hesitated, calculating risks and waiting for backup, one figure moved without pause. Private First Class Rebecca Martinez had always been different, not in the ways that made heroes in movies, but in the quiet, almost invisible ways that made others uncomfortable. She was the soldier who flinched during live-fire exercises, who took an extra second to respond to shouted orders, who seemed to drift somewhere else entirely when gunfire erupted during training simulations. Her squad mates had a name for it. They called it freezing up, and they were convinced it would get them all killed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca had arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix 6 months earlier, fresh out of advanced infantry training, with scores that told 2 different stories. Her marksmanship was exceptional, her tactical knowledge near perfect, her physical conditioning above average. But her combat simulation results painted a different picture entirely. Delayed reactions, hesitation under pressure. Instructors noted concerns about performance under live combat conditions. The other soldiers noticed immediately. During her first week, when training mortars detonated nearby, Rebecca would stop mid-sentence, her eyes going distant. When helicopter rotors thundered overhead during supply drops, she would unconsciously step backward, creating space between herself and the aircraft. Most telling of all, during live ammunition exercises, while other soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, Rebecca seemed to move through water, every action deliberate, but somehow slower than everyone else. Staff Sergeant David Thompson, a 12-year veteran with 3 combat deployments, watched her with growing frustration. Rebecca had been assigned to his squad, and he took responsibility for his soldiers seriously. Too seriously, some said. He had seen good soldiers die because their squad mates couldn't perform under pressure, and he wasn't about to let it happen again. Thompson made his concerns known to anyone who would listen. During morning briefings, he would shake his head when Rebecca's name came up on patrol assignments. At the mess hall, he would lower his voice but speak loud enough for others to hear about soldiers who couldn't handle the pressure when bullets started flying. He never mentioned Rebecca by name, but everyone knew who he meant. The whispers spread like wildfire through the small base. Other soldiers began watching Rebecca more carefully, looking for signs of the weakness Thompson had identified. They found what they were looking for, or thought they did. When convoys returned from missions with stories of contact with enemy forces, Rebecca would sit alone, staring at her hands. When wounded soldiers were brought to the medical station, she would volunteer to help but move with what others interpreted as reluctance. Corporal James Washington, a soldier 2 years older than Rebecca but with similar experience, began voicing what others were thinking. During equipment checks, he would mutter about soldiers who couldn't be counted on when things got real. During downtime, he would tell stories about soldiers he had known who looked good on paper but fell apart when the shooting started. Rebecca heard the whispers, felt the sideways glances, noticed how conversations stopped when she approached. But she never defended herself, never explained what others interpreted as weakness. She simply continued with her duties, maintaining her equipment with meticulous care, studying tactical manuals late into the night, volunteering for every training exercise regardless of how the others treated her participation. What her squad mates didn't know, what Rebecca had never told anyone, was that she wasn't freezing up during those moments of apparent hesitation. She was calculating. While others reacted instinctively to sudden sounds and movements, Rebecca's mind automatically began processing variables: distance to cover, angles of potential incoming fire, escape routes, tactical advantages and disadvantages of every position. It was a skill developed during a childhood that had required constant vigilance. Growing up in East Cleveland with a father whose post-traumatic stress from Vietnam manifested in explosive, unpredictable rages, Rebecca had learned early that survival often depended on reading situations before they developed, on positioning herself advantageously before violence erupted, on thinking 3 moves ahead while others were still reacting to the first. But explaining this felt impossible, and perhaps unnecessary. Rebecca had joined the Army not to prove anything to anyone, but because she understood something about herself that others couldn't see. She knew she was different, knew her mind worked in ways that others found unsettling. But she also knew, with absolute certainty, that when the moment came, when lives hung in the balance, her difference would become strength. The doubts of her squad mates crystallized during a training exercise in the third month of her deployment. The scenario involved a simulated ambush, with instructors using blank ammunition and explosive charges to create realistic combat conditions. As the squad moved through a mock village, hidden speakers began broadcasting the sounds of incoming artillery. Smoke grenades filled the air with thick, acrid clouds that burned the eyes and throat. Most soldiers immediately sought cover, following their training to get down and assess the situation. Rebecca, however, stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. When she finally moved, it was with sudden, decisive action, but by then, according to the exercise parameters, 2 members of her squad had been declared casualties due to her delayed response. Staff Sergeant Thompson used the exercise as a teaching moment, though his lesson was harsh. In front of the entire squad, he detailed how hesitation in combat situations led to casualties, how soldiers who couldn't react quickly enough under pressure became liabilities rather than assets. He never mentioned Rebecca by name, but his eyes remained fixed on her throughout his critique. That night, Rebecca sat alone outside her barracks, cleaning her rifle with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. The weapon gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, every component maintained to perfection. She understood what her squad mates saw when they looked at her, understood their frustration and their fear. But she also understood something they didn't, the difference between reaction and response, between instinct and strategy, between moving fast and moving right. The other soldiers began finding subtle ways to exclude her from their informal networks. When plans were made for off-duty activities, Rebecca was rarely invited. When rumors circulated about upcoming missions, the information somehow never reached her until official briefings. When soldiers gathered to share stories or complaints, conversations would pause when she approached, resuming only after she had passed. Corporal Martinez, a soldier with the same surname but no relation, began making pointed comments about the importance of trust between squad members. During weapons cleaning, he would speak generally about soldiers who seemed reliable until pressure mounted, then revealed their true nature. His words carried the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had earned respect through consistent performance. Rebecca absorbed these subtle rejections without complaint, but she also began preparing more intensively for what she sensed was coming. Her personal training regimen extended beyond required exercises. She spent hours studying tactical manuals, memorizing battlefield medicine procedures, practicing equipment maintenance, until she could disassemble and reassemble her weapon blindfolded. Late at night, when the base grew quiet except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional radio chatter from the operations center, Rebecca would walk the perimeter, noting sightlines, defensive positions, and potential vulnerabilities. She mapped every building, every vehicle, every piece of equipment in her mind, creating a 3-dimensional tactical awareness that would prove invaluable when chaos erupted. The other soldiers interpreted her solitary habits as further evidence of her inability to integrate with the team. They saw someone who kept to herself not by choice but by necessity, someone whose squad mates couldn't rely on her when coordination became critical. What they didn't see was a soldier preparing herself not just to survive combat, but to excel in it, to transform what they perceived as weakness into tactical advantage. As weeks passed, the divide between Rebecca and her squad mates widened. They functioned as a unit during official duties, following orders, and completing missions with professional competence. But the informal bonds that held effective fighting units together, the trust that allowed soldiers to move as one organism in combat, never developed. Rebecca remained on the outside, watched and judged, and found wanting by soldiers who had never seen her tested under actual fire. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with pre-dawn equipment checks and mission briefings delivered in the same monotone voices that had become routine. But as the convoy prepared to leave the relative safety of the base, heading into territory where previous patrols had reported increased enemy activity, Rebecca felt something her squad mates had never seen before. She felt ready. The convoy rolled out at 0600 hours under a sky painted in shades of amber and rose. 4 armored vehicles carrying 24 soldiers, each one a link in a chain that would either hold strong or break under pressure. Rebecca sat in the third vehicle, her M4 carbine held in a relaxed grip that belied the tension she could feel radiating from the other soldiers around her. Specialist Tyler Brooks sat across from her, his jaw working methodically on a piece of gum, his eyes scanning the landscape through the small armored windows. Brooks had been with the unit for 8 months and had seen enough action to earn the respect of veterans like Staff Sergeant Thompson. He was the kind of soldier others looked to for cues, the kind whose confidence or fear could spread through a squad like wildfire. Brooks had never openly criticized Rebecca, but his silence spoke volumes. When other soldiers made comments about reliability under fire, Brooks would nod almost imperceptibly. When patrol assignments were discussed, he would suggest alternative arrangements that somehow never included Rebecca in critical positions. His disapproval was professional, clinical, and therefore more cutting than outright hostility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mission was routine by Forward Operating Base Phoenix standards, a patrol through the villages of Kalat and Zari, checking on local infrastructure projects, gathering intelligence, and maintaining the American presence that kept insurgent activity suppressed. Intelligence reports suggested minimal threat levels, though everyone understood that in this part of Afghanistan minimal threat could escalate to maximum danger in the space between heartbeats. As the convoy moved through increasingly rugged terrain, the radio chatter maintained its professional cadence. Position reports every 15 minutes, weather updates, communication checks with base operations. But underneath the routine communications, Rebecca detected something others missed: a subtle change in the local population's behavior. In the first village, children who normally ran alongside military vehicles remained indoors. Market stalls that typically stayed open regardless of military presence had closed early. Even the dogs seemed quieter, more alert. Rebecca noted these details while her squad mates focused on standard security protocols, checking for obvious signs of improvised explosive devices or suspicious individuals. Private First Class Angela Chen, the squad's designated marksman, occupied the position directly behind the vehicle's main gun. Chen had earned her role through exceptional shooting skills and steady nerves under pressure. She was one of the few soldiers who treated Rebecca with something approaching neutrality, neither openly dismissive nor particularly welcoming. Chen's focus remained fixed on her sector of responsibility, scanning for threats with professional competence. The second village revealed more subtle indicators that made Rebecca's tactical instincts sharpen. Windows that should have been open in the morning heat remained shuttered. A motorcycle that had been parked near the main road during previous patrols was gone. Most significantly, the local police checkpoint that typically flagged down the convoy for brief, friendly exchanges was unmanned. Rebecca keyed her radio, intending to report these observations, but hesitated when she heard Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice responding to a routine check from the lead vehicle. His tone carried the confidence of a soldier who had navigated dozens of similar patrols without incident. Reporting her concerns would likely be dismissed as overthinking, another example of her inability to distinguish between genuine threats and normal variations in local behavior. Instead, she began making mental preparations for possibilities her training had taught her to consider. She checked her ammunition load, confirmed the positions of her medical supplies, and reviewed the layout of the convoy in her mind. If her instincts proved correct, if the subtle signs she was reading indicated preparation for an attack, she wanted to be ready to respond effectively, rather than simply react to events as they unfolded. The attack came at 0847 hours, in a location that tactical manuals would later describe as perfectly chosen for maximum effect. The convoy had entered a narrow valley where the road curved around a series of large boulders, creating natural choke points that limited maneuverability. On both sides, rocky outcroppings provided elevated positions for attackers while offering minimal cover for defenders. The first explosion struck the lead vehicle with devastating precision. The improvised explosive device had been buried in the road surface and triggered remotely, creating a blast that lifted the front of the armored truck and sent it crashing onto its side. The vehicle's occupants, including Staff Sergeant Thompson, found themselves trapped in a metal cage that had suddenly become a death trap. Within seconds, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions on both sides of the valley. The distinctive crack of Alaska 47 rifles mixed with the deeper boom of rocket-propelled grenades, creating a symphony of violence that transformed the peaceful morning into chaos. The convoy's remaining vehicles returned fire immediately, but their positions in the narrow valley left them exposed and vulnerable. Rebecca's vehicle, third in the convoy formation, became the focal point of concentrated enemy fire. The driver, Corporal Michael Santos, fought to maintain control as bullets shattered the windshield and punched holes in the armored sides. Santos was a competent soldier and experienced driver, but the intensity of the attack tested his skills to their limits. In the passenger compartment, soldiers who had been relaxed minutes earlier now pressed themselves against whatever cover they could find, returning fire through gun ports while trying to identify enemy positions. The confined space filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic taste of fear that every combat veteran recognized but few acknowledged. Specialist Brooks, his earlier confidence replaced by the focused intensity of survival, coordinated the squad's response with the same methodical precision he brought to equipment maintenance. His voice carried clearly over the radio despite the chaos around him, calling out enemy positions and coordinating with the other vehicles. Under pressure, Brooks revealed why Thompson trusted his judgment. He possessed the rare ability to think clearly when others might panic. But as the firefight continued, it became clear that the convoy faced a more serious threat than a typical ambush. The attackers had positioned themselves not just to inflict casualties, but to prevent the Americans from maneuvering out of the kill zone. Every attempt to move forward or backward brought increased fire from concealed positions that seemed to anticipate the convoy's tactical responses. Private First Class Chen, maintaining her position behind the main gun despite the intense incoming fire, began systematically engaging targets with the precision that had earned her the marksman role. Her shots were deliberate and effective, forcing several enemy fighters to abandon their positions. But for every position she neutralized, two more seemed to open fire from locations the squad hadn't identified. The radio traffic grew increasingly urgent as the convoy's situation deteriorated. The overturned lead vehicle couldn't move, trapping Thompson and 7 other soldiers in a position that was becoming untenable. The rear vehicle had sustained engine damage and was losing mobility. Rebecca's vehicle, though still functional, found itself becoming the primary target for enemy fire as attackers recognized it as the convoy's strongest remaining asset. It was then that Rebecca began to understand what her instincts had been trying to tell her during the patrol through the villages. This wasn't a random attack or a target of opportunity. The enemy had been tracking the convoy's movements, studying its patterns, and preparing for this specific engagement. The subtle signs she had noticed in the villages weren't just indicators of local tension, but evidence of careful coordination and planning. As this realization crystallized in her mind, Rebecca also understood something else. The conventional tactics her squad was employing, while textbook correct, weren't going to be sufficient to break contact and extract the convoy from the kill zone. The enemy had anticipated standard American responses and positioned themselves accordingly. What the situation required wasn't adherence to established procedures, but the kind of unconventional thinking that her squad mates had always viewed as weakness. The moment that would define not just the battle, but Rebecca's entire military career, was approaching rapidly. In the overturned lead vehicle, 8 soldiers, including Staff Sergeant Thompson, faced a situation that was deteriorating by the minute. Enemy fighters were beginning to maneuver closer to their position, and the disabled vehicle's defensive capabilities were limited. Rebecca could hear Thompson's voice over the radio, maintaining professional composure despite his desperate circumstances. He was calling for suppressive fire to cover a potential evacuation of his vehicle, but everyone understood the tactical reality. Any soldier who left the relative protection of their armored vehicle to assist the trapped squad would be exposed to fire from multiple directions. As she listened to the radio traffic and assessed the tactical situation, Rebecca felt something her squad mates had never seen before. Not the hesitation they expected, not the freezing up they feared, but a clarity of purpose that came from finally understanding that this moment, this crisis, was exactly what she had been preparing for her entire life. The girl who had learned to read violence before it erupted, who had developed the ability to think strategically under pressure, who had spent months studying every aspect of combat tactics while her peers questioned her commitment, was about to show them what real soldiers looked like when everything was on the line. Rebecca's hands moved with surgical precision as she began redistributing her equipment, her mind processing tactical variables at a speed that would have surprised her doubters. While Specialist Brooks coordinated suppressive fire and Private Chen engaged targets from their relatively protected position, Rebecca was calculating something entirely different: the mathematical probability of success for an approach that violated every principle of conventional infantry tactics. The overturned lead vehicle lay approximately 200 meters ahead, positioned at the base of a rocky slope that provided enemy fighters with elevated firing positions. Between Rebecca's position and the trapped soldiers stretched an expanse of broken ground that offered minimal cover: scattered boulders, a few scraggly bushes, and a shallow depression that might provide temporary concealment, but no real protection from small arms fire. Any reasonable tactical assessment would conclude that crossing that ground under fire was suicide. The enemy had positioned themselves specifically to prevent exactly this kind of rescue attempt. Multiple machine gun positions commanded overlapping fields of fire across the entire approach route. Rocket-propelled grenade teams had clear sight lines to any potential cover positions. It was a perfect killing field, designed to turn heroic intentions into additional casualties. But Rebecca saw something different in the terrain, something her unique way of processing information had revealed during the months of solitary perimeter walks at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The rocky outcroppings that provided enemy firing positions also created blind spots, narrow corridors where the overlapping fields of fire didn't quite connect. The timing of enemy fire patterns suggested limited ammunition supplies and the need for coordinated reloading sequences. Most importantly, the attackers' positions, while tactically sound for a defensive ambush, were poorly arranged for tracking a single target moving unpredictably across varied terrain. Corporal Santos, still fighting to keep their vehicle operational despite increasing mechanical problems, noticed Rebecca's preparations with growing alarm. Santos had served 2 previous deployments and possessed the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving multiple combat engagements. In his experience, soldiers who started redistributing equipment and checking ammunition loads during active firefights were usually preparing to do something that would get themselves and others killed. Santos tried to catch Rebecca's attention, intending to remind her that their orders were to maintain defensive positions and wait for reinforcements, but the intensity of incoming fire demanded his complete focus on keeping their vehicle mobile and operational. The enemy had begun concentrating their efforts on disabling the convoy's remaining functional vehicles, recognizing that immobilizing the Americans would make them easier targets for sustained attack. Private First Class Chen, maintaining her disciplined fire from the vehicle's gun position, had begun to notice something troubling in the enemy's tactical behavior. The attackers were systematically working their way closer to the overturned lead vehicle, using coordinated movement and covering fire to advance positions that would allow them to finish off the trapped Americans. Her marksman's training had taught her to read battlefield patterns, and the pattern she was observing suggested that Thompson and his squad had perhaps 10 minutes before their position became completely untenable. Chen tried to communicate this assessment to Brooks, but the specialist was fully engaged in coordinating radio traffic with the other convoy vehicles and the base operations center. Brooks had requested air support, medical evacuation helicopters, and rapid reaction force deployment, but everyone understood that help was at least 30 minutes away. The convoy would have to hold its positions and protect the trapped soldiers, using only the resources immediately available. This was precisely the kind of tactical puzzle that Rebecca's mind had been unconsciously preparing to solve for months. While her squad mates focused on established procedures and conventional responses, she had been developing an intuitive understanding of how individual initiative could exploit gaps in enemy planning. The attackers had prepared for predictable American tactics, but they hadn't anticipated a single soldier operating outside doctrinal parameters. Rebecca began her movement with a technique that would later be studied in advanced infantry schools as an example of adaptive battlefield innovation. Instead of attempting to cross the open ground in a straight line, she used the terrain's natural contours to create a zigzag approach that took advantage of every available microtopography feature. Each movement was calculated to minimize exposure time while maximizing confusion among enemy observers trying to track her progress. Her first bound took her to a cluster of rocks approximately 30 meters from her starting position. The movement drew immediate fire from multiple enemy positions, but Rebecca had timed her dash to coincide with what she had identified as a natural pause in the attacker's fire pattern. As bullets struck the rocks around her hiding place, she was already planning her next movement, using the sound and direction of incoming fire to refine her understanding of enemy positions. Specialist Brooks, realizing what Rebecca was attempting, tried to recall her over the radio, but she had switched her communication device to receive-only mode to avoid compromising her position with transmission sounds. Brooks found himself in the impossible position of watching a squad member undertake what appeared to be a suicide mission while being unable to either stop her or effectively support her movement. Rebecca's second bound carried her to a shallow depression that provided concealment but no protection from direct fire. She could hear bullets passing overhead and striking the ground around her, but her calculations had been correct. The enemy positions couldn't achieve effective converging fire on her location due to the terrain features she had identified during her reconnaissance. From this position, she could see the overturned lead vehicle more clearly and assess the condition of the trapped soldiers. Staff Sergeant Thompson was visible through a gap in the vehicle's armor, coordinating his squad's defensive fire despite what appeared to be a significant head wound. The other 7 soldiers were returning fire from various positions around the overturned vehicle, but their ammunition expenditure suggested they were running low on supplies. More critically, Rebecca could see enemy fighters maneuvering closer to Thompson's position, using dead ground that wasn't visible from the other convoy vehicles. Her third movement brought her within 50 meters of the trapped squad, but also within effective range of enemy small arms fire from multiple directions. This was the point where conventional tactics would require her to seek cover and wait for support, but Rebecca understood that waiting would mean watching 8 fellow soldiers die while she remained safely hidden. Instead, she did something that defied every principle of individual survival her instructors had taught her. She stood up and began running directly toward the enemy positions, firing her weapon not to achieve precise hits, but to create maximum noise and confusion. Her movement was erratic, unpredictable, designed to overwhelm the enemy's ability to track and engage a single fast-moving target. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Enemy fighters who had been methodically advancing on Thompson's position suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. Their carefully coordinated assault pattern dissolved as individual fighters tried to engage this new threat while maintaining their positions against the convoy's defensive fire. Rebecca's unconventional approach created something that military theorists call tactical disruption, a moment when established battle patterns break down and new possibilities emerge. The enemy fighters had prepared for predictable American responses, but they hadn't anticipated a single soldier who would sacrifice personal safety to create tactical opportunities for others. As she closed the final distance to the overturned vehicle, Rebecca could see Thompson's face clearly for the first time since the ambush began. His expression revealed something she had never seen before: recognition that the soldier his squad had dismissed as unreliable was risking everything to save their lives. But more than recognition, she saw something else in his eyes that would change how every soldier in the unit understood courage, commitment, and what it meant to earn the right to wear the uniform. The rescue was about to begin, but what Rebecca had already accomplished was perhaps more important than what she was about to do. She had proven that strength didn't always announce itself with loud voices and obvious displays. Sometimes it moved quietly, calculated carefully, and revealed itself only when everything else failed and lives hung in the balance. The girl who had been dismissed as someone who would freeze up in battle was about to show 8 trapped soldiers what real warriors looked like when courage mattered more than survival. The first soldier Rebecca reached was Private Danny Rodriguez, pinned beneath a section of twisted metal that had torn loose during the vehicle's violent rollover. Rodriguez was conscious, but losing blood from a deep gash across his forehead, his rifle lost somewhere in the wreckage. When he saw Rebecca sliding into position beside him, his eyes widened with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. Rodriguez had been one of the quieter critics of Rebecca's perceived weaknesses, never openly mocking but nodding along when others questioned her reliability. Now, as she worked with swift efficiency to free him from the debris, he found himself face to face with a soldier whose competence under fire exceeded anything he had witnessed in 18 months of military service. Rebecca's medical training, honed through countless hours of studying field manuals while others socialized, manifested in movements that were both gentle and decisive. She assessed Rodriguez's injuries while simultaneously scanning for immediate threats, her mind processing multiple streams of information without losing focus on the task at hand. A pressure bandage appeared from her medical kit, applied with the precision of someone who understood that seconds could mean the difference between life and permanent disability. Staff Sergeant Thompson, observing Rebecca's work from his position near the vehicle's rear, felt something shift in his understanding of leadership and judgment. Thompson prided himself on reading soldiers accurately, on identifying strengths and weaknesses that might not be apparent to casual observers. Yet, watching Rebecca work under fire, he realized his assessment had been fundamentally flawed, based on peacetime observations that had no correlation to combat performance. The second soldier requiring immediate attention was Specialist Karen Williams, trapped in the vehicle's passenger compartment with what appeared to be a dislocated shoulder and possible internal injuries. Williams was one of the unit's most experienced communications specialists, responsible for maintaining contact with base operations and coordinating support requests. Her radio equipment had been damaged in the crash, leaving the trapped squad without reliable communication links to the outside world. Rebecca's approach to Williams demonstrated tactical thinking that went beyond simple rescue procedures. Rather than attempting to extract the injured soldier immediately, she first established a defensive position that would protect both of them during the extraction process. Using the overturned vehicle's bulk as cover, she created a small protected space where she could work without exposing Williams to additional enemy fire. The extraction itself required both physical strength and technical knowledge. Williams was trapped by her equipment harness, which had become entangled with damaged vehicle components during the rollover. Rebecca's understanding of military gear, developed through those solitary hours of equipment maintenance her squadmates had dismissed as obsessive behavior, now proved invaluable. She knew exactly which straps to cut and which to preserve, how to maintain the integrity of Williams's protective gear while freeing her from the wreckage. As Rebecca worked, enemy fire continued to impact around their position, but with noticeably less coordination than before. Her unexpected assault had disrupted the attackers' planned sequence of operations, forcing them to react to her initiative rather than following their predetermined timeline. Several enemy fighters had shifted positions to engage her, creating gaps in their coverage of the other convoy vehicles and allowing Specialist Brooks and Private Chen to maneuver into more effective firing positions. The third and fourth soldiers, Corporals Mark Jefferson and Lisa Chen, had taken cover on the far side of the overturned vehicle, but were effectively pinned down by enemy fire from elevated positions on the rocky slope. Both soldiers were mobile and uninjured, but their position offered no protection from rocket-propelled grenade attacks, and enemy fighters were maneuvering to achieve angles that would allow them to target the soldiers directly. Rebecca's solution demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that military academies would later use as case studies in adaptive leadership. Instead of attempting to move Jefferson and Chen to safer positions, she used smoke grenades to create concealment, then guided them in establishing a defensive position that actually strengthened the overall tactical situation. By positioning the two soldiers to cover approaches that enemy fighters had been using to advance, she transformed potential victims into active defenders. The fifth soldier, Private Tommy Chen, presented the most complex medical challenge. Chen had sustained what appeared to be internal injuries during the vehicle rollover and was showing signs of shock and blood loss. Moving him would require careful handling to prevent additional trauma, but leaving him in his current position meant exposure to increasingly accurate enemy fire as attackers adjusted their aim points. Rebecca's medical assessment revealed training that went far beyond basic field aid. Her civilian background, which she had never discussed with her military colleagues, included emergency medical technician certification earned during 2 years of community college before enlisting. The skills she had developed responding to car accidents and domestic violence calls in East Cleveland now served her well in a combat environment where textbook procedures had to be adapted to battlefield realities. Working with Jefferson and Lisa Chen, Rebecca improvised a stretcher using material salvaged from the damaged vehicle. The construction required engineering insight as well as medical knowledge, creating a device that would protect Tommy Chen's spine while allowing rapid movement across rough terrain. The improvisation demonstrated capabilities her squadmates had never suspected, skills developed through years of making do with insufficient resources, and finding solutions where others saw only problems. Staff Sergeant Thompson, coordinating the defensive efforts of his remaining mobile soldiers, found himself relying increasingly on Rebecca's tactical assessments. Her positioning recommendations proved consistently accurate. Her understanding of enemy movement patterns more sophisticated than his own combat experience had led him to develop. The soldier he had dismissed as unreliable was demonstrating leadership qualities that exceeded those of soldiers with far more experience and formal training. The 6th and 7th soldiers, Sergeant First Class Michael Davis and Private Janet Torres, had established a fighting position that provided good defensive coverage but poor evacuation routes. Both soldiers were experienced fighters, but their position would become untenable if enemy forces continued their current rate of advance. Moving them required coordination between multiple elements, timing that would minimize exposure while maintaining defensive capabilities. Rebecca's solution involved what military theorists call battlefield geometry, using terrain features and movement timing to create temporary advantages that could be exploited for tactical gain. She coordinated with Brooks and the other convoy vehicles to create suppressive fire patterns that would allow Davis and Torres to move to more secure positions without compromising the overall defensive setup. The coordination required radio communication skills that revealed another dimension of Rebecca's hidden capabilities. Her knowledge of military communication protocols was comprehensive. Her ability to coordinate complex movements under fire demonstrated training and preparation that went far beyond minimum requirements. The quiet hours she had spent studying technical manuals while others socialized had created expertise that was now proving crucial to mission success. But the 8th soldier presented the greatest challenge of all. Staff Sergeant Thompson himself had sustained injuries that limited his mobility, but more importantly, he remained responsible for coordinating the overall defensive effort. Moving him meant temporarily disrupting the command structure that was holding the trapped squad together, but leaving him exposed meant risking the loss of their most experienced leader. Rebecca's approach to this final extraction would require not just physical courage and tactical skill, but the kind of leadership presence that transforms individual heroism into collective survival. The soldier who had been dismissed as someone who would freeze up under pressure was about to demonstrate what real command presence looked like when everything was on the line. As she prepared for the most dangerous phase of the rescue operation, Rebecca understood that success would require more than just saving 8 lives. She would need to prove that strength came in forms her critics had never recognized, that true warriors were measured not by their loudest moments, but by their willingness to risk everything when others needed them most. The extraction of Staff Sergeant Thompson required Rebecca to make a decision that would define not only the remainder of the battle, but her understanding of what leadership meant in the crucible of combat. Thompson's leg was trapped beneath a section of the vehicle's dashboard, and his attempts to free himself had only worsened what appeared to be a significant fracture. More critically, his position provided the best oversight of the defensive perimeter, and moving him would temporarily blind the squad to enemy movements on their vulnerable flanks. Rebecca knelt beside Thompson, her hands already assessing the extent of his injuries, while her eyes maintained constant surveillance of their surroundings. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The soldier Thompson had questioned as unreliable was now responsible for his survival, while the leader who had doubted her judgment was forced to depend entirely on her tactical decision-making. Thompson's voice, strained but steady, carried a tone Rebecca had never heard from him before. Instead of the crisp authority he typically employed, his words reflected something approaching vulnerability mixed with professional respect. He began to outline his assessment of their tactical situation, sharing information about enemy positions and movement patterns that he had observed but hadn't yet communicated to the other convoy vehicles. What emerged from their brief conversation was a revelation that would reshape how both soldiers understood the relationship between rank, experience, and battlefield effectiveness. Thompson's observations, while valuable, were based on conventional military analysis that followed predictable patterns. Rebecca's insights, developed through her unique way of processing information, had identified enemy behavioral patterns that Thompson's traditional training hadn't prepared him to recognize. The enemy force, Rebecca explained as she worked to free Thompson's leg, wasn't operating according to standard insurgent tactics. Their coordination was too sophisticated, their equipment too uniform, their tactical discipline too advanced for typical local fighters. The attack represented something more organized and potentially more dangerous than the convoy had initially assessed. This was not an opportunistic ambush, but a carefully planned operation executed by fighters with military training and substantial resources. Thompson absorbed this intelligence while watching Rebecca work with tools improvised from vehicle debris and medical supplies. Her movements demonstrated mechanical knowledge that exceeded anything in her official training records. The techniques she employed to leverage the dashboard debris suggested engineering understanding that came from sources beyond military instruction. Once again, Thompson found himself confronting the reality that his assessment of Rebecca's capabilities had been fundamentally incomplete. As Rebecca maneuvered Thompson free from the wreckage, the tactical situation around them continued to evolve in ways that validated her earlier analysis. Enemy fighters were beginning to employ more sophisticated tactics, using coordinated movement and advanced communication to counter the convoy's defensive measures. Several positions that had been suppressed by fire from the other vehicles were being reoccupied by fresh fighters, suggesting a reserve force larger than initially estimated. The evacuation of Thompson to a more secure position required coordination with the entire defensive effort. Rebecca used hand signals and radio communication to orchestrate covering fire from multiple sources, while simultaneously managing the physical challenge of moving an injured soldier across dangerous terrain. Her coordination skills revealed leadership capabilities that had been invisible during peacetime operations but proved essential under combat conditions. Private First Class Chen, observing Rebecca's performance from her position with the convoy's main gun, found herself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about what constituted military effectiveness. Chen's marksmanship training had taught her to value precision, consistency, and adherence to established procedures. But watching Rebecca adapt continuously to changing circumstances while maintaining focus on mission objectives demonstrated a different kind of military excellence that was perhaps more valuable than textbook competence. Specialist Brooks, coordinating radio traffic and fire support from his vehicle position, discovered that Rebecca's tactical recommendations were consistently more accurate than his own combat-tested assessments. Her suggestions for repositioning defensive fires and adjusting communication protocols proved effective in ways that challenged his understanding of how battlefield leadership developed. The soldier he had dismissed as unreliable was demonstrating strategic thinking that exceeded capabilities he had observed in soldiers with significantly more combat experience. With all 8 soldiers successfully extracted from the immediate danger zone around the overturned vehicle, Rebecca faced a new challenge that would test different aspects of her tactical abilities. The enemy force had adapted to her rescue operation by shifting their attack pattern to focus on the convoy's remaining vehicles. The successful extraction had saved 8 lives, but it had also concentrated the entire American force in positions that were becoming increasingly vulnerable to sustained attack. Rebecca's solution required her to think beyond individual heroism toward comprehensive tactical planning. Rather than continuing to react to enemy initiatives, she proposed a coordinated counterattack that would exploit weaknesses in the enemy position that her unconventional approach to terrain analysis had revealed. The plan required precise timing and coordination between elements that had never operated together under combat conditions. The counterattack began with Rebecca leading a small element including Jefferson and Lisa Chen in a flanking movement that targeted enemy communication positions she had identified during her initial rescue dash. Her route selection demonstrated 3-dimensional thinking that took advantage of dead space and natural concealment that conventional tactical analysis had overlooked. The movement required individual initiative and judgment that challenged traditional notions of military discipline and command authority. Meanwhile, Thompson, despite his injuries, coordinated suppressive fire from the defensive positions to support Rebecca's flanking movement. His role reversal from questioning her capabilities to depending on her tactical leadership represented a transformation in military thinking that would influence how the entire unit understood combat effectiveness. The respect in his voice when he acknowledged her tactical assessments was genuine and hard-earned through shared danger and proven competence. The flanking attack succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, not because of superior firepower or numerical advantage, but because Rebecca's unconventional approach had identified enemy vulnerabilities that standard tactical doctrine wouldn't have revealed. Enemy fighters who had positioned themselves to counter predictable American responses found themselves under attack from directions they hadn't anticipated, by soldiers employing movement techniques that didn't conform to expected patterns. As enemy resistance began to collapse under the pressure of Rebecca's coordinated assault, helicopter gunships finally arrived to provide the air support that had been requested at the beginning of the engagement. But the helicopters found a tactical situation that had already been resolved through individual initiative and adaptive leadership, rather than conventional military procedures. The rescue that was supposed to save the convoy had been accomplished by the soldier everyone thought would need saving herself. The aftermath of the engagement revealed casualty figures that would later be studied as an example of how individual courage could influence large-scale tactical outcomes. 8 soldiers had been extracted from certain death, enemy forces had been defeated despite numerical and positional advantages, and the convoy had maintained operational capability despite sustaining what should have been mission-ending damage. Most significantly, these results had been achieved by a soldier whose capabilities had been consistently underestimated by her peers and superiors. But for Rebecca, standing among the soldiers she had saved while enemy positions continued to burn on the rocky slopes around them, the most important outcome wasn't tactical or strategic. It was the expression in Staff Sergeant Thompson's eyes as he looked at her with something approaching awe, and the realization that she had finally found the moment where all her hidden preparation and unrecognized strengths could serve the purpose for which she had joined the military in the first place. The debriefing at Forward Operating Base Phoenix took place in a conference room that had witnessed countless after-action reports, but nothing quite like what Colonel Sarah Richardson was hearing from the survivors of Convoy Bravo 7. Richardson, a career officer with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for thorough tactical analysis, found herself repeatedly asking for clarification of details that seemed to challenge established principles of small unit operations. Staff Sergeant Thompson sat at the conference table with his leg elevated and bandaged, his usual commanding presence tempered by something that looked remarkably like humility. As he recounted Rebecca's actions during the ambush, his voice carried none of the dismissive undertones that had characterized his previous assessments of her performance. Instead, he spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that his words would become part of an official record that might be studied by future military leaders. Thompson's account focused on tactical details that revealed the sophistication of Rebecca's battlefield thinking. Her route selection during the rescue operation had demonstrated terrain analysis capabilities that exceeded what was taught in advanced infantry schools. Her medical procedures had followed protocols that suggested training beyond standard military first aid. Most significantly, her coordination of the counterattack had employed battlefield geometry and timing that indicated strategic understanding, typically associated with much higher levels of military education. Specialist Brooks, still processing his own transformation from skeptic to advocate, provided supporting testimony that corroborated Thompson's assessment while adding details about Rebecca's communication skills and leadership presence under extreme pressure. Brooks had observed military leadership in various forms during his deployment, but he had never witnessed someone transition so seamlessly from individual initiative to tactical command while maintaining situational awareness and decision-making clarity throughout a complex engagement. The intelligence officer conducting the debriefing, Major Robert Chen, paid particular attention to Rebecca's assessment of enemy capabilities and organization. Her observations about the attackers' sophisticated coordination and equipment suggested preparation and resources that indicated a more serious threat than typical insurgent activity. The implications extended beyond the specific engagement to broader questions about enemy capabilities throughout the region. Rebecca herself remained characteristically quiet during most of the formal debriefing, answering direct questions with the same methodical precision she brought to equipment maintenance and tactical planning. But when Colonel Richardson asked her to explain her decision-making process during the rescue operation, her response revealed depths of tactical thinking that surprised even Thompson, who had observed her performance firsthand. Rebecca's explanation demonstrated understanding of battlefield dynamics that incorporated psychological factors alongside purely tactical considerations. She had recognized that the enemy's tactical plan depended on American adherence to standard operating procedures, and that success required approaches that would disrupt enemy expectations while exploiting gaps in their coordination. Her analysis revealed strategic thinking that challenged conventional distinctions between individual initiative and unit-level planning. The medical evaluation of the rescued soldiers provided additional evidence of Rebecca's capabilities that extended beyond combat performance. Private Rodriguez's injuries had been treated with techniques that prevented permanent nerve damage. Specialist Williams's shoulder dislocation had been managed in ways that minimized long-term mobility issues. Most impressively, Private Tommy Chin's internal injuries had been stabilized using field-expedient procedures that undoubtedly saved his life and prevented complications that could have resulted in permanent disability. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base medical officer reviewing the treatment procedures, found herself consulting textbooks to understand some of the techniques Rebecca had employed. The improvised medical equipment demonstrated engineering knowledge that complemented her emergency treatment skills. More significantly, her prioritization of treatment procedures revealed clinical judgment that suggested training and experience beyond what appeared in her military records. The investigation into Rebecca's background, conducted as part of the standard procedure following exceptional performance under combat conditions, revealed details that explained capabilities her military colleagues had never suspected. Her civilian emergency medical technician certification provided context for her advanced first aid skills. Her employment history included work with a construction company that explained her mechanical knowledge and problem-solving approaches. Most revealing was her volunteer work with a crisis intervention program that had developed her ability to function effectively under extreme psychological pressure. But the investigation also revealed personal motivations that transformed her military service from routine duty into something approaching a calling. Rebecca's father, whose post-traumatic stress had shaped her childhood understanding of violence and survival, had served with distinction in Vietnam before his psychological wounds made civilian adjustment impossible. Her decision to enlist represented not just career choice but an attempt to honor sacrifice she had witnessed firsthand while developing capabilities that might prevent others from experiencing similar losses. The formal recognition process began with recommendations from Thompson and Richardson that worked their way through command channels with unusual speed. Military bureaucracy typically moves slowly, especially regarding individual commendations, but Rebecca's actions had implications that extended beyond routine heroism. Her performance challenged assumptions about how combat effectiveness developed and demonstrated capabilities that military training programs might need to recognize and cultivate more systematically. Within weeks, Rebecca found herself facing a different kind of pressure as word of her actions spread throughout the military community. Media attention, initially focused on the dramatic rescue story, began exploring broader questions about women in combat roles and the ways military organizations identified and developed leadership potential. Rebecca's preference for privacy conflicted with institutional needs for positive publicity, creating tensions she had never anticipated. The other soldiers from the convoy experienced their own forms of transformation as they processed what they had witnessed and participated in during the engagement. Private First Class Chen requested transfer to Rebecca's squad, recognizing that serving alongside someone with proven combat capabilities offered learning opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Specialist Brooks began studying the tactical procedures Rebecca had employed, seeking to understand approaches that might improve his own battlefield effectiveness. Most significantly, Staff Sergeant Thompson initiated changes in squad training procedures that incorporated lessons learned from Rebecca's performance. His new approaches emphasized individual initiative and adaptive thinking alongside traditional military discipline. The squad that had once questioned Rebecca's reliability became a laboratory for developing the kind of flexible tactical thinking that had proven so effective during the convoy ambush. But perhaps the most important recognition came from the soldiers Rebecca had saved, who understood better than any official commendation what her actions had meant for their survival and their families' futures. Private Rodriguez returned to duty with full mobility preserved. Specialist Williams resumed her communications responsibilities without permanent limitations. Private Tommy Chen recovered completely from injuries that could have ended his military career and compromised his long-term health. For these soldiers and their families, Rebecca's heroism represented something beyond individual courage or tactical brilliance. It demonstrated the profound impact that one person's commitment to others could have when preparation met opportunity and character proved stronger than fear. The soldier they had once dismissed as unreliable had risked everything to ensure they could return home to their loved ones, and that debt could never be adequately acknowledged through official channels alone. As Rebecca continued her deployment with a squad that now understood her true capabilities, she carried knowledge that would influence every subsequent military challenge she faced. She had proven to herself and others that strength came in forms that weren't always immediately recognizable, and that the greatest military virtues often developed in silence before revealing themselves in moments when everything else failed and lives hung in the balance. 6 months after the convoy ambush, Rebecca Martinez stood before the Pentagon senior leadership in a ceremony that would have seemed impossible during her early days at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second-highest decoration for valor, hung from a ribbon around her neck, but the weight of the medal felt insignificant compared to the transformation it represented in how the military understood courage, capability, and the often invisible qualities that defined exceptional soldiers. General Patricia Williams, the Army Chief of Staff, delivered remarks that placed Rebecca's actions within the broader context of military evolution and the ongoing development of combat leadership doctrine. The rescue operation had become a case study taught at the Command and General Staff College, analyzed not just for its tactical innovations, but for its demonstration of how individual initiative could overcome systemic disadvantages when conventional approaches proved insufficient. The ceremony attendees included military leadership from multiple services, but the most meaningful presence for Rebecca came from the 8 soldiers whose lives she had saved. Staff Sergeant Thompson, now fully recovered and serving as a senior instructor at the infantry school, had traveled from Fort Benning specifically to witness her recognition. His presence represented personal redemption, as much as professional respect, acknowledgement of how fundamentally his understanding of military leadership had changed. Private Rodriguez, promoted to specialist and serving with distinction in his new assignment, spoke during the ceremony about the moment he realized that the soldier he had once dismissed was risking everything to save his life. His words carried weight that transcended military protocol, representing the voice of someone who understood viscerally what courage looked like when everything else failed and only character remained. Specialist Williams, now a sergeant and communications chief for her unit, had become an advocate for recognizing diverse forms of military excellence that might not conform to traditional expectations. Her own career trajectory had been influenced by watching Rebecca demonstrate capabilities that challenged conventional assumptions about how combat effectiveness developed and manifested under pressure. The investigation that followed Rebecca's actions had revealed systematic gaps in how the military identified and cultivated exceptional potential among its personnel. Traditional evaluation methods, focused on obvious displays of confidence and aggression, had consistently overlooked soldiers whose strengths manifested differently but proved equally valuable under combat conditions. Rebecca's case became a catalyst for developing more comprehensive assessment approaches that recognized diverse forms of military excellence. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a military psychologist studying combat stress and resilience, had spent months analyzing Rebecca's psychological profile to understand how someone who appeared vulnerable under simulated conditions could perform so exceptionally during actual combat. Her research revealed that some individuals processed stress differently, appearing hesitant during artificial scenarios while demonstrating extraordinary clarity and effectiveness when facing genuine threats. The findings challenged fundamental assumptions about how military training programs should identify and develop leadership potential. Rebecca's apparent weaknesses during peacetime exercises had actually represented sophisticated stress processing mechanisms that proved advantageous during real combat situations. Her hesitation during simulations reflected analytical thinking that became tactical superiority when applied to genuine battlefield challenges. Rebecca's influence extended beyond individual recognition to institutional changes that would affect future generations of military personnel. Training programs began incorporating scenarios designed to identify soldiers whose capabilities might not be apparent through conventional assessment methods. Leadership development courses started emphasizing adaptive thinking and individual initiative alongside traditional military virtues. The squad that had once questioned Rebecca's reliability had become a model unit whose performance exceeded expectations across multiple deployment cycles. The tactical innovations they had developed, based on lessons learned from Rebecca's approach to battlefield problem-solving, were being studied and adapted by units throughout the military. Their success demonstrated how individual excellence could influence collective performance when properly understood and implemented. Staff Sergeant Thompson, reflecting on his own evolution as a leader, had become a vocal advocate for recognizing different forms of military strength and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating soldier potential. His transformation from skeptic to supporter represented broader changes in military culture that Rebecca's actions had helped catalyze. But perhaps the most significant impact of Rebecca's story emerged in the letters that arrived from military families whose loved ones had been influenced by her example. Parents wrote about daughters who had found courage to pursue military careers despite facing skepticism about their suitability for combat roles. Veterans shared stories about how Rebecca's example had helped them recognize their own unacknowledged strengths and contributions. The ripple effects extended into civilian communities, where Rebecca's story became a touchstone for discussions about hidden potential and the importance of looking beyond conventional measures of capability. Schools used her example to encourage students who didn't fit traditional definitions of success. Businesses began reconsidering how they evaluated and developed employee potential. Rebecca herself remained characteristically modest about the attention her actions had generated, focusing instead on the soldiers she continued to serve alongside and the ongoing responsibilities of military life. Her promotion to sergeant had come with assignment to a training unit, where she could share the tactical knowledge and leadership approaches that had proven so effective during the convoy engagement. Young soldiers arriving for advanced infantry training found themselves learning from someone whose methods challenged traditional approaches while achieving superior results. Rebecca's instruction emphasized individual thinking and adaptive problem-solving alongside conventional military skills, preparing future leaders for complex battlefield environments where textbook solutions might prove insufficient. The classroom where Rebecca taught tactical procedures displayed a simple plaque that captured the essence of what she had demonstrated during that chaotic morning when 8 lives hung in the balance. The inscription read, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear when others need you most." The word served as a daily reminder to her students that heroism often emerged from sources that weren't immediately apparent. As Rebecca concluded another day of instruction, watching young soldiers grapple with tactical problems that would prepare them for challenges they couldn't yet imagine, she understood that her greatest contribution might not be the 8 lives she had saved during a single engagement, but the countless future soldiers who would approach their own crucial moments with better understanding of what real strength looked like. The girl who had been dismissed as someone who would freeze up in battle had become a teacher of warriors, passing along lessons learned not just through study and preparation, but through the transformative experience of discovering that courage lived in quiet places and revealed itself only when everything else failed and character was all that remained. Her legacy would be measured not in medals or ceremonies, but in the soldiers who would carry forward the understanding that true strength often moved silently until the moment when moving was all that mattered. The documentary crew that arrived to film Rebecca's story captured something unexpected in their interviews with the soldiers whose lives she had saved. Each man and woman spoke with a reverence typically reserved for discussions of fallen comrades, but these were testimonials about someone who had given them the gift of life itself. Their words painted a picture of transformation that extended far beyond a single moment of battlefield heroism. Private Tommy Chen, whose internal injuries had nearly proved fatal, described how Rebecca's calm presence during his medical treatment had provided psychological stability that proved as crucial as her technical expertise. Chen had been conscious throughout his extraction and treatment, aware that his life hung in precarious balance. Rebecca's steady voice and confident movements had given him something to focus on besides his fear, creating a psychological anchor that helped him maintain the will to survive during his most vulnerable moments. Sergeant First Class Davis, the experienced fighter who had been repositioned during the tactical phase of the rescue, shared insights about Rebecca's leadership style that revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. Rather than issuing direct orders, she had made tactical suggestions that allowed experienced soldiers to maintain their dignity while benefiting from her superior situational awareness. Her approach demonstrated emotional intelligence that complemented her tactical brilliance. The ripple effects of Rebecca's actions continued to generate unexpected developments years after the original engagement. Military medical schools began incorporating her improvised treatment techniques into their curricula, recognizing that battlefield medicine often required innovation that went beyond standardized procedures. Engineering programs studied her mechanical solutions to extraction problems, finding applications for similar approaches in civilian rescue operations. International military observers requested briefings on the tactical innovations Rebecca had employed, recognizing potential applications for their own forces facing asymmetric warfare challenges. NATO training exercises began incorporating scenarios based on her engagement, testing how different military cultures might adapt her approaches to their own operational contexts. The influence of a single soldier's actions had expanded to affect military thinking across multiple nations and alliance structures. Rebecca's hometown of East Cleveland established a scholarship program in her name, supporting young people who demonstrated potential that might not be recognized through conventional academic measures. The program specifically sought students who showed resilience, creativity, and commitment to serving others, regardless of their performance on standardized tests or traditional metrics of achievement. The first recipients included teenagers who had overcome significant personal challenges while maintaining focus on goals that would benefit their communities. The Veterans Administration Hospital, where Rebecca's father had received treatment for his post-traumatic stress, contacted her to establish a mentorship program connecting combat veterans with young service members facing similar psychological challenges. Rebecca's understanding of how trauma could be transformed into strength provided unique insights for helping others navigate the complex relationship between military service and personal healing. Military chaplains began incorporating Rebecca's story into discussions about finding purpose through service, using her example to help soldiers understand how individual actions could create meaning that transcended personal recognition or advancement. Her willingness to risk everything for others demonstrated spiritual principles that resonated across different faith traditions while remaining grounded in practical military virtues. The tactical manual that emerged from analysis of Rebecca's engagement became required reading at military academies worldwide, but its influence extended beyond purely military applications. Business schools used her decision-making processes to teach crisis management and adaptive leadership. Medical schools studied her prioritization methods for managing multiple critical patients simultaneously. Engineering programs analyzed her problem-solving approaches for applications in complex technical challenges. Rebecca's mother, Maria Martinez, became an inadvertent spokesperson for military families, invited to speak at events supporting veterans and their loved ones. Maria's perspective on raising a daughter who would later demonstrate such extraordinary courage provided insights into how family experiences could shape military service in unexpected ways. Her stories about Rebecca's childhood revealed early indicators of the characteristics that would prove so valuable during combat. The neighborhood where Rebecca had grown up began displaying banners acknowledging her service, but the recognition meant more to longtime residents who remembered the quiet girl who had helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and tutored younger children struggling with homework. Their pride reflected understanding that heroism often developed through small acts of service long before dramatic moments revealed its full dimensions. Young women considering military careers cited Rebecca's example as evidence that strength came in many forms and that traditional stereotypes about combat effectiveness might not reflect the full range of capabilities valuable in modern warfare. Military recruiting offices reported increased interest from applicants whose backgrounds and characteristics might previously have been overlooked, suggesting that Rebecca's story was encouraging diversity that would strengthen future military units. The congressional hearing that examined lessons learned from Rebecca's engagement resulted in legislative changes affecting military personnel policies. New regulations required more comprehensive evaluation processes that looked beyond conventional performance indicators to identify soldiers whose potential might be expressed differently under various conditions. The changes represented institutional acknowledgement that military effectiveness was more complex and varied than traditional assessment methods had recognized. Rebecca's assignment to the training unit had evolved into a broader role, developing new instructional approaches that recognized diverse learning styles and preparation methods. Her courses attracted soldiers from throughout the military, who wanted to understand unconventional approaches to tactical thinking and battlefield problem-solving. The waiting list for her programs extended months in advance, reflecting widespread recognition of the value her perspectives could provide. The research conducted by military psychologists studying Rebecca's case contributed to broader understanding of how stress affected performance and how apparent weaknesses might actually represent different forms of strength. Their findings influenced selection criteria for special operations units, recognizing that soldiers who processed information differently might possess advantages in complex operational environments. International peacekeeping organizations requested consultation on how Rebecca's approaches might be adapted for civilian protection missions in conflict zones. Her methods for operating effectively while minimizing risk to vulnerable populations offered insights valuable for humanitarian workers and civilian protection specialists operating in dangerous environments. The annual ceremony commemorating the convoy engagement became a focal point for broader discussions about military values and the importance of recognizing excellence in all its forms. Rebecca's continued participation, despite her preference for privacy, demonstrated ongoing commitment to helping others understand that heroism was accessible to anyone willing to prepare thoroughly and act decisively when circumstances demanded extraordinary effort. Military historians placed Rebecca's actions within the broader context of American military evolution, noting how individual initiative had consistently influenced tactical development throughout the nation's conflicts. Her engagement represented continuation of traditions dating back to Revolutionary warfighters, who had improvised solutions to challenges that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. The foundation established in Rebecca's honor focused on supporting educational opportunities for young people from backgrounds similar to her own, recognizing that exceptional potential often emerged from unexpected sources when provided with appropriate support and encouragement. The foundation's work extended internationally, supporting programs that identified and developed leadership potential among youth in communities affected by conflict or economic hardship. In the end, Rebecca Martinez had proven that heroism wasn't about being the loudest or most obvious soldier in the unit. It was about being ready when others needed you most, regardless of what anyone else thought about your capabilities. Her legacy demonstrated that true strength often developed quietly, revealed itself gradually, and influenced others in ways that extended far beyond any single moment of crisis. The lesson she taught through example rather than words would continue influencing military thinking, civilian leadership development, and individual understanding of human potential for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.